Welcome to How Positive Are You? In this episode, we have with us Austrian gynecologist and AIDS rethinker Dr. Christian Fiala to talk not about HIV, but a virus with a similar name, HPV, Human Papilloma Virus. As we will see, it has more than 2 letters in common with HIV. I'm David Crow, president of Rethinking AIDS, calling in from Calgary, Canada, and with me is my co-host with the mostest, Elizabeth Ely, just call her Beth from New York City. Hi Beth, how's the village?
Cold. Thanks for the Arctic front, David.
You're welcome. It's nice and warm up here in Canada, so we're pleased to ship our cold weather south.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to have Christian Fiala here talking about HPV. We're kind of breaking new ground here in discussing other diseases that are either made-up diseases or the causation of them is really not pinned down as much as the media has led us to believe. So let's go.
And now for some feedback from our listeners.
Yes, and we seem to have gotten quite a lot of feedback on our recent episode with Dawn Lester and David Parker on why germs don't make you ill and drugs can't cure you on Facebook and elsewhere. Some of them quite detailed, and we can only go over some of it, but this seems to have been quite an explosive topic, quite controversial, wouldn't you say, David?
Yeah, I think the most detailed response we got was from Curtis Hagen, who's an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy at SUNY Plattsburgh. And I'll read part of his email, and then I'll respond a little bit to him. We had an email correspondence going back and forth, so I'll just summarize some of that. Curtis wrote, I've been listening to your podcast with interest over the past couple of months. Though I don't always agree with what I take to be your assessment of the import of the specific lines of evidence pursued on your show, I do agree that there are a number of problems and oddities about the official story of AIDS. Indeed, I'm skeptical of the official story about a lot of things. I've published articles and made presentations in which I expressed my skepticism regarding the official story of 9/11, for example. And so I respect your intellectual courage and fortitude for continuing to put yourselves out there on such a taboo subject, and I sincerely hope you can continue and wish you both the best. Now, regarding your last show, even I was a bit incredulous. Germs don't cause illness? Really? Are you sure you want to be associated with that idea? You're already pretty far out on a limb, and I admire you for it, but does it really make sense to cut the limb off behind you? Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking you to distance yourself from a position for pragmatic reasons. If you think it's defensible, then by all means defend it. But I think you would be doing yourself a favor if you looked critically at Dawn Lister and David Parker's work and made clear in your next episode where you agree with them and where you disagree. And if you do substantially agree with them, I think you must give your audience a better defense of their position than they were able to muster in the last episode. Well, I responded to him. I started with an article I'd written on syphilis, for example, which is another disease model that's rotten when you actually look at it. It's diagnosis based on antibodies. The pathogen is virtually never found. All kinds of assumptions are made. The treatment was given until the antibodies disappeared, which is a bizarre, not biologically sustainable. And I said that there's a lot of disease models that when you look at them closer have an environmental component that is not considered. Polio is like this, West Nile virus. And even when a germ is involved, such as in the case of tuberculosis, it may be only causing disease when something else happens. So if you work in a mine where you're exposed to fine and possibly toxic dust for many years, you may come down with tuberculosis. Can we say it's the germ that is the sole cause of the disease? So I don't go as far as Dawn and David in saying that germs never cause disease, and I'm not even sure that they said that. But I think that in most cases, germs are just a cofactor, or they're just a consequence of abuse of the body through work exposures, through home exposures, through many different things.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception here that just by putting them on and asking them softball questions that we were advocating what they were saying. I think we were certainly giving them the best possible forum to explain everything that they meant, and without necessarily taking a position on that, though I tend to give them a big benefit of the doubt on what they're saying. And I've noticed that, possibly something concurrent with germs. I'm not even saying even a cofactor like you're saying, but things that show up in the same place that germs show up, like certain toxins that provide food for germs, that they might cause illness, and that germs are a good marker for that. There are many, many possibilities here, and I encourage our audience to consider that and to please understand that we're just laying out the information here. Whether we're advocating for it is quite another matter. I'm advocating for their need and ability to give out this information, and your ability to disagree with it and send us feedback that you do.
Yeah, I think it's important to listen to them. I talked to Dawn about the book. I said that it really was unfortunate that the book has really no references in it. I agreed with most of what they wrote, but there were places where I thought to myself, really? Did you actually find that written down somewhere? So it really would have helped to have references. But then on the other hand, I said that if your book had references, it would probably be 1,000 pages long instead of 100. So there's you can't produce a small book and have references and footnotes and all that kind of stuff that you'd have in an academic treatise.
Right. It is, that said, it is a good start toward this kind of thinking, which is so unfamiliar to us, and as we mentioned, so reinforced by a kind of superstition in our culture that we normally don't question it at all. I really like their reasoning process. I have to say, I advocate for that. I'm prepared to put my reputation on the line for the ability to reason like this.
Right. I mean, one disease model that doesn't get talked about a lot, occasionally crops up, is anthrax, which is supposedly a bacteria that causes these horrible attacks on your lungs. But I did a little bit of research, not a lot, on anthrax, but I discovered that the anthrax bacteria is found in soil widespread around the world. It's found just about everywhere. And that these really bad cases of anthrax were found among sheep shearers. So these are people who worked in wool sheds, so an enclosed, relatively enclosed environment where there were small particles of sheep's wool in the air throughout the entire shearing season. And so these people were ingesting small particles of wool into their lungs. So is it really a surprise that they would get lung disease? Do we really need a bacteria to explain the fact that these older sheep shearers would come down, or maybe if there are particular weather conditions, maybe no wind and very hot, that there'd be this, quote, outbreak of disease? Do we really need a germ to explain that, or can we explain some of these things purely on an environmental grounds?
Oh, right. And if they didn't test positive for that germ, their disease would just be called lung disease or lung cancer or something. It would just go into a different classification.
And does the anthrax bacteria colonize lungs that have been damaged environmentally? And so are we kind of looking at anthrax as a cause, but it's actually a consequence?
Yeah. Does it show up in people who aren't sheep shearers too? I mean, or do the symptoms, and some of the symptoms that they were describing for so-called anthrax back in the big hysteria about it in late 2001 just sounded to me like garden variety flu. I mean, it could be a million other things, and yet because of the hysteria, people were encouraged to think that it was anthrax. So I have a lot of problems with anthrax. Yes. Exactly.
Well, I don't want to dally too long on the introduction to this podcast. I'd like to get to our guests, but I think my major point is I want people to think about these things. And so let's put on provocative guests. And if you've got a problem with it, then please write. And this detailed email from this professor, I really appreciate the opportunity to get into a respectful discussion where both of us can possibly move our ideas forwards and learn a little bit more about the world and our health and other things.
And please send more feedback. info@howpositiveareyou.com. And perhaps you will agree with Aaron, who appreciates us. He wrote on the Rethinking AIDS Facebook page, "Your podcast was excellent. By the way, Elizabeth, this was on number 75 on cannabis oil, which I don't believe I did alone. I think it was David as well. He says, "Excellent, Elizabeth. As always, keep up the good work. You're amazing." So thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Yes, from both of us. And now I think we should get to our guest.
Yes,
Okay.
let's.
Christian Fiala is a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology and medical director of the GynMed Clinic for Contraception and Abortion in Vienna and Salzburg, both in Austria. He's a member of the research group in reproductive health at the Karolinska University Hospital in Stockholm. He's a member of the board and past president of the International Federation of Professional Abortion and Contraception Providers, and founder and director of the Museum of Contraception and Abortion in Vienna. He's also been advocating to make the drug misoprostol more available. We know him better as one of the early AIDS dissidents, a member of the South African Presidential AIDS Advisory Panel, and a longtime member of the Rethinking AIDS board. Today, we want to combine his knowledge of virus myths with his knowledge of gynecology and talk about HPV, the Human Papilloma Virus, that supposedly infects women and causes cervical cancer. Welcome to the show, Christian.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
Well, it's very good to have you with us, and Beth and I have been excited that you're finally going to be able to join us. Can you start by describing what the HPV, what the human papilloma virus is supposed to be, and what, if any, connection there is with cervical cancer?
Well, yes, it's true what you said in the introduction that HPV and HIV have similar names, but not only the names I think are similar, but also the business concept resembles a lot. And I think it is true to call HPV the HIV 2.0 from a business point of view. If we go through, we will find quite a surprising number of similarities between both viruses, not so much from the medical side, but from the business point of view. And the first problem with HPV and cervical cancer is the official terminology, which clearly states cervical cancer is HPV associated. In other words, both occur at the same time sometimes, and sometimes they appear independently from each other. Officially, if you look up scientific publications or well-researched lay articles, no one states HPV caused cervical cancer. It's always associated.
And the vaccine itself, which is now being promoted heavily, and that's the business issue you're talking about, I presume. That's how money is made out of HPV. The vaccine couldn't have been proven to reduce cancer, could it? Like, what has the vaccine been proven or shown to do?
Well, the vaccine is intended to prevent or to protect from HPV infection, from the infection with the virus. And the assumption is that if you prevent or protect the infection from HPV, then this person will be protected from a cancer possibly being caused by that virus. Now, this hypothesis depends entirely on the assumption of a causal relationship of the cancer being caused by the virus and nothing else. Because if it is just a pure coincidence, a bypassing virus, then you won't have much effect to have a vaccine against this virus. Even if this vaccine is effective against the virus, it will not have much impact on the cancer.
Right. Now, Zurhausen, who's the doctor who got the Nobel Prize in 2008 for supposedly discovering HPV and its supposed association with cervical cancer, he had a paper, and it's cited in the Nobel prize citation, claiming that women with HPV are 300 times more likely to get what I'll just read this, high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions. What are these things, and how are they related to cervical cancer? And do you think his estimate of a 300 times greater risk is accurate?
Well, the main problem lies in the terminology which you cited correctly. You said he got the Nobel Prize for discovering the association. Now, we need to be clear about this, and this is really crucial in the whole debate. An association is not necessarily a causal relationship. Just to give you an example, while children getting older, they usually are better reading in reading text or books. Obviously, getting older and the capacity to read are closely associated. Mm-hmm. But you would not draw the conclusion in saying, well, if children by getting older they read better, we can skip school anyway, because by getting older they will just read better anyway. No one would draw that conclusion, because it's not automatically by getting older that you have a better reading capacity. So these things, reading and getting older, they are associated but not necessarily caused.
Well, maybe you could say that it's actually the reading that causes you to get older. So if you stop reading, you won't get older.
Yeah.
Well, we have many associations. The frequency of storks in eastern Austria is correlated with the number of deliveries in a certain 10-year period. In the past, but obviously no one would claim that the storks have brought the children. Now, this is just to give you another example of the problem of correlation or association, right. And to the problem to find out whether there is this is a pure coincidence or whether there is a causal relationship.
Is it possible that the process towards cancer causes the pathology, whatever high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions are, and causes the generation of the genetic material that we call HPV? Could they both be caused by the development of cancer?
Well, it is important to understand that this association, as it is correctly labeled, is based on the finding that a certain percentage of women with a cervical cancer, they also have this virus, or you can find the virus in the cervix of these women. In some women, you find the virus but no cancer, and in some women, you find a cancer but no virus. But in a high percentage of women, of women with cervical cancer, you also find at least some types of this virus. And the crucial question, and that's really the core question of the whole debate, is whether this correlation or this association is purely coincidental on whatever basis. We have absolutely no idea. It could be just purely coincidental for a variety of reasons, or whether this association is really the result of a causal relationship. And to this day, there has been no proof of a causal relationship. And even if you read all the scientific papers and all the studies that have been done with the new vaccine, and you read the introduction, and some papers they falsely claim, the HPV causing cervical cancer. And then if you look up the reference for this citation, you end up at papers which never showed didn't prove anything. They just confirmed this association. And so this is extremely unsatisfactory, because it's to develop a vaccine and to start all these vaccine campaigns, is really a huge adventure. And before embarking on such an adventure, you should know in which direction to head for.
The Nobel Prize citation said, discoveries whether these vaccines are effective in preventing not only against cervical lesions, but also cervical cancer and death, must await the collection of epidemiological data during the coming decades.
Decades, not 5 years.
That's quite honest in saying we have, but what they say in plain language is we have absolutely no idea whether or not this will have any effect on cervical cancer, which is true. And to my knowledge, and I have carefully read and carefully studied the existing publications and medical literature on this topic, there is absolutely no indication, not the slightest indication that there will be an impact on cervical cancer, or that there will be a reduction in cervical cancer. Absolutely no indication to that, and I think this is not a surprise.
I think this thing has been discovered maybe 13 years ago or 14 years ago, and they're saying it will take decades to figure it out. Well, we've only got 1 decade so far, and I think they've only got about 5 years on this vaccine, so they're claiming things that they no longer have. But what stood out for me and what Christian just said was that they are telling the truth in these articles, in this research. They are not falsifying research as far as we know. But what is happening is something gets lost in translation, that they go from this statement that it will take decades to sort out the causation rather than the association. But then this gets translated to causation somehow. And I think part of the way that it happens is through false citations in science, that they will cite to a previous study and say that it proves causation when the study itself only proves association. Have you seen that happening? A false citation?
Well, it is one of the most frequent errors in science and in medicine to take a correlation for a causation. And actually, this is a basic teaching issue in medicine and especially in epidemiology. If you find a correlation, it does not automatically mean you have a causation. And if I give you this example of the storks and the number of deliveries in Eastern Austria, I mean, everyone will obviously say, oh, well, that must be pure coincidence because no one believes in the theory of storks anymore. So this is very kind of an easy example and an obvious example. But then there are other correlations where we are inclined to think, oh, maybe there is some causation, or where we can't exclude a causation. And this is a very important aspect in science, to check and verify correlations, because frequently correlations can be a first indicator of a causal relationship. So we should absolutely not ignore correlations. What we have to do is we have to carefully analyze them and see whether they are helpful and whether there is a truly causal relationship, or whether it's pure coincidence.
Right, and it's very difficult outside of an experimental setting to actually prove causation. I mean, experiments are really set up to try to prove causation, but how would you prove causation in the case of HPV? Even if the vaccine was associated with a reduction in the number of cases of cervical cancer, that would not be proof that the vaccine had any impact at all.
On cancer, you mean?
Well, this is exactly what science is there for. Excuse me to be so blunt, but that is kind of the core business of science, isn't it? To see whether or not to check and verify certain questions. That's kind of our job as doctors and as scientists, to see whether there, for example, in HPV, whether this is just pure coincidence or this association, or whether there is a causal relationship.
Right, and in particularly in the case of the vaccine, let me quote from the Centers for Disease Control cervical cancer statistics. Cervical cancer used to be the leading cause of cancer death for women in the United States. However, in the past 40 years, the number of cases and the number of deaths have decreased significantly. The decline is largely the result of many women getting regular Pap tests, which can find cervical precancer before it turns into cancer. Now, let's not worry about the Pap test for now, but what this is saying is that the number of cases of cervical cancer is going down. It's very low in terms of other cancers. So if the rate continues to go down, it will almost certainly be credited to the vaccine, even though for the past 40 years it's been going down. So how would you know from epidemiological statistics whether the vaccine was effective or not?
Well, this is a good question, and I think the statistics are the next issue we would need to discuss, and I would be happy to come back to that. But I just would like to stay with the first issue, which is really crucial, because that's the core issue about this association and whether or not there's a causal relationship between HPV and cervical cancer. And most publications correctly state HPV-associated cervical cancer. Then there are some studies or some publications who claim there is a causal HPV causing cervical cancer, and then you need to look at the references, and these references never, so far, what I have seen, and I verified whatever was published, never ever cited a single study proving a causation of the cervical cancer.
Well, that's what I was getting to when I was talking about false citation.
Exactly.
The references.
Exactly.
You know, you can do your study that says there's only an association between storks and babies, okay? And you honestly report that. And then somebody picks that up in the next study. I think our listeners need to understand how scientific journals work, that further studies build on previous studies. So the next scientist comes along and he cites your study as proof that storks cause babies. And you didn't say that. And But
that's
actually
scientific
seen that happen.
fraud.
It is.
I know it.
I've seen it
does
done.
happen.
I've seen it done. Yeah. It happens all the time.
I call it scientific laundering, kind of like money laundering, where you take dirty, unclear, uncertain science, and by repeating it in other papers, and each time elevating the certainty with which you associate your statements, you turn really bad, uncertain, well, maybe not bad science, but really uncertain science into something much more powerful. I think that's what's been happening a lot in science.
Let's call it fraud, what it is, yes.
Well, it is. I think fraud implies that you have kind of a purpose. You're doing that intentionally, and I wouldn't go as far as saying journalists and scientists do that intentionally. I think it is rather what we really see frequently in science and medicine, that people don't really make the distinction between a correlation and causation. And many people just think, oh yeah, if it occurs at the same time, well, that's because it's caused by the one is caused by the other, and it's really but the result, of course, is completely wrong and totally wrong. And you just mentioned before the difficulty to get an answer, and so far. The only answer to that question about correlation being a causal relationship comes from maybe an unexpected source, namely Peter Duisberg.
Mm-hmm.
And this scientist from Berkeley, he just published in the end of the last year a study on the chromosomal characteristics of cervical cancers. And he studied cancer cells of different patients, some of them having HPV virus found in the cervical cancer and some without HPV. If you assume that cervical cancer is caused by a virus, then you would expect that the cancer cells being caused by that virus have some kind of similarity,
right,
structurally, chromosomically, whatever. They are. If you assume the cancer is caused by that virus, so then all the cancer cells kind of follow the same line of wrong development.
So what you're saying that Peter Duesberg found is that there is no difference on any measure he could use, that he could find, between cervical cancer cells associated with HPV and those that are unassociated with HPV.
Right. And secondly, he did not find any similarity in the group of the cancers with HPV and in the group without. So there were random distribution of all characters. There are two aspects. If you have kind of if you would assume HPV is causing cancer, and then you compare several cancers with HPV association and several cancers where there's no HPV association, you would expect that both groups inside their group share some similarities.
Yes.
Those cancers associated with HPV would have some similarities in their group, and the other group not being caused by HPV would also share some similarities. So you would have a similarity within the both groups, and you would have some kind of difference between the groups when comparing both groups.
Okay. And what did he actually find?
And he found a random distribution of differences over all groups. In other words,
so there was no pattern.
There was absolutely no pattern with HPV or without HPV. HPV had no impact on any character or was not associated with any aspect, being it chromosomal or structural, of the cell of this cancer cell.
So this would disprove the causation.
Exactly.
So the causation with HPV.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I think that we've discussed this causation versus association very much, and I know that Christian needs to leave very soon. He's a very busy man, and I just wanted to sort of connect that to this concept of risk-benefit, because every time you see this vaccine challenged as perhaps too dangerous because a few people, admittedly very rare, have died or have gotten illnesses, that you have to look at the risk-benefit. In other words, it's okay to sacrifice a few virgins. Okay, it's okay if the risk of getting cervical cancer or the benefit of not getting cervical cancer is so huge that it just buries that risk of sacrificing a few virgins. And I say this not even tongue-in-cheek. They are definitely sacrificing virgins, and that is definitely the purpose here. It's a psychological thing. But when you talk about risk, you should also be talking about the risk of getting cervical cancer, and the risk of HPV causing cervical cancer, and they never go back that far in their reasoning. They just assume that the risk of getting HPV-caused cervical cancer is pretty much infinite, and they encourage people to go to the CDC website and check out the statistics for themselves and decide for themselves to make an informed decision. So, which as far as I always knew was their job. Their job was to tell you what they concluded, and they're not doing that. They're dropping the ball. So could you speak to the risk-benefit? I mean, what are the risks of getting cervical cancer, and what are the risks of getting it due to HPV, and what are the risks? What are the statistical risks? Can we quantify that of getting an adverse reaction to this vaccine?
Well, yes, I think this risk-benefit analysis is actually kind of at the end of the analysis and is kind of the conclusion. The risk-benefit analysis would represent the conclusion of the whole debate. And the whole to arrive there, to get there, you have to go through several aspects. And we just had the main question: is cervical cancer caused by HPV? And the answer so far is, if you look at all the published evidence, there is no proof that that HPV is causing cervical cancer. There's some association, and there is the first study showing to the contrary, that cervical cancer is not being caused by HPV. And then the second aspect is what David just said about the statistics. How big is your risk to get cervical cancer? And I think this is pretty easy and straightforward to answer. It is cervical cancer, as tragic as it is for those women who get it. There is absolutely no doubt that it is really a very tragic disease. But if you look at the population, it's a rather rare event. It's not among the most frequent cancers, and it is not among the most frequent reasons for dying. So it is really a sideline in public health. It should not be neglected, just as all other small risks should never be neglected. But we need to keep to look at the numbers. It is a small risk, and there are numerous other small risks, unfortunately, on this earth that endanger our health and life. So it's not the main cause of illness. It's not the main cause of death for women.
Yeah, if I can just follow that point, according to the U.S. cancer statistics, cervical cancer is not one of the top 10 cancers. Deaths from all types of cancer in women between 2006 and 2010 were 175.3 per 100,000, and out of that, cervical cancer was 2.6 out of 100,000. So it's a very small cancer risk of death, not counting all the other reasons why somebody might die. And I believe that the total number of women who died from cervical cancer in the United States in 1 year was about 4,000, of which they claim that 70% are associated with HPV. So that's maybe about 3,500 deaths that could possibly be prevented, and hundreds of millions of women would have to be vaccinated.
Even if you would accept for a moment, just for the sake of argument, if you would accept for a moment that the vaccine works, the question is it an intelligent and worthwhile initiative compared to all other risks?
Right.
If you would, for example, think, well, if you could ban all firearms, would in North America or in the States, would that save more lives? And probably that would be even a cheaper initiative than to vaccinate the whole population. So you need to compare that. And in addition to being a rather rare disease, also the prevalence decreases. The number decreases. Every year they go down. And in Austria, we are, together with Finland, the only country in Western Europe where the vaccine is not covered by Social Security. So we have a very low vaccination rate. And the numbers continue to go down comparably to other countries in Western Europe who have the vaccine.
Right. So that's a very important point.
Yes, you find this is a very absurd situation. We have a continuous decline in Austria of cervical cancer in parallel to the decline of other countries.
Right.
What are some of the risks of the vaccine? Like, what are some of the side effects that have been noted?
Well, if you talk about vaccines side effects, and that's a very important issue, obviously, the interesting thing is that most people think, oh, yeah, side effects is something that occurs within a couple of minutes or a couple of hours after the shot. And then the whole debate focuses exclusively on these short-term side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they are important, but and they happen, but that is not what is really worrying with HPV vaccine. What is really worrying is the long-term side effects, and especially neurological long-term side effects.
And how long have they tested this? How long have they tested the side
Well,
effects
the problem
so far?
is that they never most of the studies never looked at the long-term side effects. And if you talk to doctors, doctors are giving these shots, they are not even aware that the vaccine they are giving can have long-term side effects on neurological aspects.
Right.
They are not even aware. So if a woman comes and first of all, the vaccine is given frequently by gynecologists, and then the woman, if she has a neurological problem, she wouldn't even go back to her gynecologist. So he wouldn't learn about this side effect in the first place. And even if he would learn about it, he would say, well, a neurological problem a few weeks after the shot can't have any association with the shot, can't it?
Well, he doesn't know. Well, also, how long have they been testing this shot?
Well, it is, of course, then that's the next problem. How long have we investigated this vaccine, and what have we been looking for? And then they say there's if you start scratching, you just find one problem after the other. The first problem is that it is not. It's just a couple of years we have been testing this vaccine, and then another problem is they didn't do a proper placebo-controlled trial, and this is really a fraud, really a scientific fraud, that they claim these studies were placebo-controlled, and they claim they have given a placebo. But if you look up the studies carefully, and that is what most people don't do,
Mm-hmm.
if you read the methods and material and method section of these studies, which is considered the most boring part of the publications, but if you read that, you realize that they didn't use a proper placebo. They used the same liquid which they used for the vaccine trial, kind of the verum group. The only difference was in the so-called placebo group. It contained all the substances of the true vaccine except the virus particles. But it contained all the stabilizers and all the substances like aluminium and everything else. So this is really a fraud, because a placebo, there is actually no debate about what a placebo is. A placebo is a substance which contains absolutely no active ingredient, nothing that can cause any reaction. It's kind of an empty water, if you want.
Wouldn't that actually go against the interests of the vaccine company?
What they say then is, look, we have here this placebo-controlled trial, and we couldn't find. And this is how they argue. If you look up the studies, they say then, no, we couldn't find any difference in side effects between the placebo and the verum group.
Because everybody was getting contaminants. Right.
I understand from a side effect point of view, but from the effectiveness of the vaccine, if, say, the immunological effect is partly due to the aluminum or the other things that they put into it, surely that would reduce the apparent effectiveness of the vaccine if the only difference was these so-called viral particles. But from a side effect profile, I agree that totally destroys monitoring for side effects.
I mean, this is really a fraud, and these vaccines, apparently they induce antibody reaction to these virus proteins in the verum group. So these vaccines, they are effective in inducing antibodies against these virus proteins, and the placebo group doesn't have virus proteins, so the placebo group didn't produce any antibodies to this virus, against these virus proteins. So it works, yes, in the sense that it seems to induce antibodies against virus proteins. But the main question is it not only helpful against the virus, but will it in the end prevent cervical cancer?
Yes.
Right.
That's the key
core
question. The question here is, how can women protect themselves from cervical cancer? I have actually had cervical cancer, or have had it diagnosed, which I believe wasn't a clear diagnosis. They differ, my doctors do. But how can women, and women like me, protect ourselves from cervical cancer? What would be effective?
Well, one of the most effective ways is to reduce risks, and that the prime risk is smoking. That's well established. There is no question about it. So if you stop smoking, you have done a great deal to reduce your risk of cervical cancer. And then the main question in this vaccine debate: can the vaccine be effective against cervical cancer? We know it is effective in increasing antibodies, but then we come back to the core question of the whole debate. The core question is association a sign of causation? Now, if we have a pure association, then giving this vaccine might be as helpful as increasing the stork population in Eastern Austria in the hope to increase birth rates. It won't have any effect. And it can only have an effect if we are sure there is a causal relationship. And as we discussed before, to that moment, there is no indication to that, and there's rather indication to the contrary.
Okay, has the vaccine been shown to reduce the risks of things like high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions? Does it reduce the risk of cellular changes, whether or not those are associated with cancer?
Well, now you enter kind of the tricky part of wordings. And if you read the studies carefully, they are full of success, and they say, oh yeah, we have reduced all kinds of precancerous lesions. And then if you analyze in detail and you read carefully, what exactly do they say? Then you realize, oh yeah, we have reduced the number of precancerous lesions associated with HPV.
Right. Okay.
And then you would say, yeah, oh great. Well, that is great. Of course, that is a success. But does it really answer the question of the women in the street?
Right.
Who wants to be protected not only from HPV-associated cancer, but who wants to be protected from cancer, period. If this vaccine is apparently quite effective against HPV, good. Now you have a precancerous lesion, or you have a woman with a precancerous lesion who got the vaccine. She doesn't have any HPV anymore. The interesting question, the only interesting question is, can this vaccine reduce the overall number of precancerous lesions and cancerous lesions? The total number, that's all of what is of interest. Because if you say, well, yeah, we give this vaccine, and then we continue to have some women with cancer or precancerous lesions, but none of them has HPV, well, that won't be of great help for the women concerned.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And also, if the precancerous lesions are an indication of the cancer process, and if you're eliminating a symptom as opposed to the underlying cause for cancer to develop, you may reduce the number of precancerous lesions, but not reduce the number of consequent cancers.
Well, yes, but the HPV is not even a symptom. It's just associated. It is just it could be, and the indicators we have so far is that it probably is just a bystander.
David,
Mm-hmm.
were you speaking of the precancerous lesions as the symptom?
Yeah, I was not talking about HPV. I was talking about the cellular changes, the precancerous lesions. I was saying that if those are the consequence of some process in the body that causes cancer, not on the direct line to causation, even if you reduce the number of those lesions, it might not reduce the risk of cancer.
The reason why these studies look for precancerous lesions is pretty easy to understand. Of course, we are interested in the number of cancers, but as we know, it takes a very long time until cancer develops, and so we are looking for early answers. And one early answer is to say, okay, instead of waiting for a few decades for a cancer to develop, we look for the precursors. This is precancerous lesions as an indicator, which I think is fair to do. But again, the problem applies to precancerous lesion as well as to cancer. If you take away one aspect of a pure association without being sure there is a causal relationship, you don't change anything on the ground.
Right.
You will have the same number of women with precancerous or cancerous lesions, and just fewer with HPV associated.
Right.
That's all you will have. And there high risk that's what we will get in the end. And if you look at the data available so far, everything points into that direction.
Beth, I think you had a question.
Yes, I've been trying to jump in here, but this is a very good line of questioning, and I'm glad that David has probed you so effectively on it. I have mentioned earlier that I was affected by a devastating diagnosis of cervical cancer, in which I was told I had to have a radical hysterectomy, and almost 2 years later, I challenged that diagnosis and just walked away from it because one of our friends in the AIDS dissident movement told me he had spent 5 hours researching what the data was on the Pap test. In other words, what were the odds of having these precancerous lesions and having them turn into cancer, and in turn having that cancer spread and kill you? He could find nothing. It's not well known that the data on the Pap test is not public. It is apparently locked in a safe in Boston somewhere, and they're coming out with some story about how now they have a better Pap test. But I would question the assumption that precancerous lesions always lead to cancer. And you just gave a little hint here. You said it might take decades for it to lead to cancer. At the age of 50, as I am now, for it to take 40 years for these lesions to develop into cancer would mean that I would suddenly face a crisis when I'm 90 years old. And I'm willing to face that risk. And also, I'm willing to reduce that risk through lifestyle factors. So can you comment on the Pap test? I mean, how accurate is it, and what does it really tell you? I mean, is that the way to go? Just keep checking for cancer until you find it?
It is obviously not a kind of a black and white diagnostic tool. There is a lot of indeterminate and intermediate results, and a lot of developments which are unexpected, and part of them are poorly understood. Still, there is kind of an increased risk that if you have a precancerous lesion, there is an increased risk that that lesion might develop into a cancer. There is absolutely no certainty, and a number of precancerous lesions would heal out, and there is no good understanding why that is the case in one situation and not the case in another situation.
Right, and we get to this situation of risk-benefit where, based on that small risk or uncertain risk, I am told that I need to eradicate all odds of getting cervical cancer by having a hysterectomy or a radical hysterectomy. I mean, it's similar. It's the same, just kill everything, take this dangerous vaccine, or take this dangerous surgery in order to reduce a very small risk.
Well, it's a little bit difficult to understand why you got a hysterectomy and so the whole uterus removed on the sole.
I did not.
Whether someone would recommend that. on the sole basis
Yes.
of a Pap smear result. Because what you
No,
usually do,
it was further than that. Yeah.
yeah, if you would,
It was more than that. Yeah.
yeah, you usually you would do a biopsy and look in the cells, and then if there is invasive sign of invasive cancer, then you would recommend to remove the uterus. The uterus is unique in the sense that it you have easy access to the cells, the surface cells of that organ, and you can analyze them and look at it and see whether there are some deformation taking place which is unexpected or worrisome. And this is for most organs you can't do that. So I think it is wise to use this diagnostic tool, but I think at the same time there is still a lot of room for improvement of this diagnosis.
Right. I should note that even when you do biopsies, sometimes the results they're subject to interpretation, and they don't even have data that they were able to share with me on that as to how far up the stream a cell has to go to be considered invasive. It seems like an arbitrary cutoff point.
Well, yes, I mean, most aspects in medicine, they are not black and white. And then it's a risk or probability. You're talking, in most situations, you're talking about probabilities. And the question is, where is your individual limit of probability? What are you ready to accept, and where do you want to intervene? And this is very different from one person to another. And there will never be a clear-cut answer. And that is part of the difficulties in life, that in many situations you end up with probabilities and and then you need to decide in the individual situation how to proceed.
Right. Thank you.
Well, I think we've addressed a lot of issues. We're coming up on 1 hour now. Beth, do you have any further questions that you'd like to address on the topic of HPV today?
I don't, but a very, very brief observation here. That I'm calling from New York City, where there is a risk of mugging that is probably higher than in the hometown where I come from. And in order to reduce the risk of muggings, I take certain precautions about what time I walk, where at night, things like that, and how I am vigilant. But in order to reduce the mugging to 0, I would have to move out of New York City. So,
and even that wouldn't reduce it to 0.
Right, exactly. I could get mugged in Kansas City. So,
even in Canada, you can get mugged.
That's right. Even in Canada, I know. Amazing that. So I think when we're talking about risk benefit, you don't cut off your arm to reduce the risk of getting arm cancer. You just don't do that. So I think that Dr. Fiala has clarified this for us very well in the hour that we've allotted for this interview, and I hope that it clears up a lot of confusion out there. Thank you so much.
Well, I think one crucial aspect which answers a lot of questions is the price. Because the main question is why is this still around, and why is there so much pressure for this vaccine? And if you look at the price, it's pretty easy to understand. I mean, it's extremely expensive, and that means there is a huge benefit margin for the companies, and a lot of money to be made, and therefore there is this incredible and almost unprecedented pressure for everyone to get vaccinated, and this indicates to the summary that HPV actually is something like HIV 2.0, and it is a business concept.
Right, and
it is a business concept to scare people, mainly women, to scare them in their sexual life, something our Christian culture is extremely experienced. We have been scared in our sexual life by the Christian religion for 2,000 years. And so this business concept sits on this experience and uses it.
Yes, I agree, and yet we're not supposed to be scared about the vaccine. If I can just finish with some statistics from the CDC, between June 2006 and March 2013, 57 million doses of HPV vaccines were distributed, and they received 22,000 adverse event reports. Now, it's usually estimated that between 1 and 10% of adverse events are reported, so that could mean that there's actually been 2 million adverse reactions out of 57 million doses of vaccine. And yet, there's only a few thousand deaths from cervical cancer in a year. So the number of deaths from the vaccine could easily start to approach the number of deaths from cervical cancer, even if it worked.
That's a very good consideration, yes. But you need to keep in mind that a lot of these really serious and grave side effects are not reported because they are neurologic, and they appear several weeks after the vaccination. And this is especially severe neurological defects, including death, sudden death, because these women, they suddenly stop breathing because of this neurotoxic effect. And then they stop breathing, and it is very difficult to prove, obviously, that this is caused by the vaccine. There is one publication that analyzed the brain tissue of 2 women who died from sudden death, and they found traces of the vaccine in the nerve cells in the brain. And you really wonder what the hell are is the vaccine doing in the brain.
Right.
And so there is a lot of danger. So in summary, you have a vaccine which is probably, as far as we can see now, not reducing the frequency of cancer. It is very expensive, extremely expensive, so it's for benefit for a few companies, and it has few but very serious side effects, including death. And so the risk-benefit analysis is clearly negative so far, and there is absolutely no argument against the claim to stop with the vaccine and do some more proper analysis. And we could easily come back in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Once we have done our analysis, it is a disease that is not frequent, and we probably will do more harm than good by continuing this mass vaccine campaign.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. You've really clarified a lot of things, and you obviously know a lot about this issue. So I really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
I know
pleasure. You have to go and you're a very busy man, but keep up the good work. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And thanks also to our listeners. Without you, we wouldn't have this show. And goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to How Positive Are You? We appreciate your support. If you want to contact us or participate in discussions, you can email us at info@howpositiveareyou.com, add a comment or download episodes from the howpositiveareyou.com website, follow us at HPAY on Twitter, or become a member of the How Positive Are You Facebook group. If you would like to advertise services that are compatible with our mission on our podcast, or become a sponsor, we would be pleased to hear from you. Don't forget to tell your friends about our podcast and help make sure these important interviews get a wider audience. And stay tuned for the next episode of How Positive Are You?